Good evening to you all. I'd like to welcome you here this evening as on behalf of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Portland State University, and the Department of Economics, and its many faculty members and almost 250 majors. Also want to welcome you on behalf of the World Affairs Council, who co-sponsors this event with us this evening. This is the third annual Harold Goodhue Vader Memorial Lecture. It's the signature lecture in a series of many events that the Economics Department holds every year, including academic seminars and lectures. It's the most important annual lecture at Portland State, we believe, and also because of who it honors. In 2007, the lecture was given by the noted macroeconomist L. Randall Wray, and last year by the 1993 recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, Douglas North. I'm pleased that we are continuing this important tradition in honor of Portland State University Professor Harold Goodhue Vader by welcoming one of the most important economists active today, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati. Professor Randy Bluffstone, the head of the department, will introduce our speaker this evening, but I want to acknowledge two of our donors who have contributed to making this event and other public events possible throughout the College of Arts and Sciences as well as in the Department of Economics. There are many who should be thanked, but for now our thanks go out to Robert McCullough and Karen Tosi, who have contributed so much of their time, energy, and I might add push, to making this event and many things that we do at this university possible. Robert and Karen, if you would stand up. I would also like to acknowledge the support and guidance of Professor Vader's widow, Dr. Joy Spalding, as well as son Mark Vader, who are, Joy I know is with us this evening. Joy, would you mind standing if you're comfortable? Thank you very much. And since we honor Professor Vader this evening, I'd like to say a few words about him. He was a friend and acquaintance of so many of us in this room with his many years here. He was at Portland State for 35 years before he died in the year 2000. He taught many courses, including economic history and the history of economic thought. And I think, as many in this room know, in his legendary commitment to students and to his love of teaching, he taught until a very few days before he died at the age of 89. He authored hundreds of articles and book reviews and over a dozen books, including some with the current PSU Professor of Economics and his friend, John Walker. Professor Vader offered reminders and evidence to us of the potentially positive role the public sector can play and has played in the U.S. economy. He experienced economic downturn firsthand, not unlike what is happening today, and indeed, he rode the rails, as he used to say, during the Great Depression, and as an economist in the federal government during the administration of President Roosevelt. Professor Vader received his bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a master's from Columbia University, and his PhD from UC Berkeley. He taught at Oregon State, the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and Carleton, but found his home here at Portland State University in all those years that he was with us. Here he carried out most of his research and taught thousands of students. And we thank all of you who had that privilege of being one of his students who might be with us here today. The faculty of the Department of Economics established this memorial lecture in 2007 as part of its community engagement activities, but also to keep alive the memory and the legacy of this consummate scholar, teacher, and humanist. So I thank you as the Dean of the College for the privilege of welcoming you here this evening. And now I would like to present to you Professor and Chair of the Department of Economics, Randy Bluffstone. Randy is a specialist in economics and natural resource sustainability, and his work carries him to countries developing and developed throughout the world. He is therefore an ideal person to introduce our distinguished speaker, who specializes in international economics, Professor Bluffstone.
Thank you very much, Dean Kaiser. It's my pleasure also to welcome you tonight to the 3rd Annual Harold Goodhue Vodder Memorial Lecture. I welcome you on behalf of the Department of Economics here at Portland State University and the 15 core members of its faculty, without whom events like this would simply not be possible. I would especially like to acknowledge the efforts of Assistant Professor Rositza Worcester, Professor Sarah Tinkler, and visiting Professor Alok Ray, as well as Karen Karskadden, for working closely with me to organize this event. I would also like to thank the World Affairs Council of Oregon, which is a co-sponsor of this event, and they've asked me to let you know that tomorrow at 6:30, the New York Times Washington correspondent David Sanger will be speaking in the Salon Ballroom at the Hilton Executive Towers. And if you're interested in attending that lecture, just go to the World Affairs Council website and you can register for it. While we're together, I would like to also join with you in honoring the graduates of Portland State University, who I and many others in this room will be joining on Saturday for the graduation ceremony at the Rose Garden Arena. I'd particularly like to congratulate those graduates who are among the 4,000 students who took economics courses this year, as well as the 260 economics majors and economics master's students. So if you would, please join me in congratulating all the PSU graduates and the faculty and staff that made their journey. As Dean Kaiser mentioned, we've had a variety of events this year, including over 20 lectures and panels. And I'm very pleased to cap off our academic year with this memorial lecture and to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati. Jagdish Bhagwati is University Professor at Columbia University and Senior Fellow in International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. Among many other policy roles, he has served as the Economic Policy Advisor to the Director General of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, Special Advisor to the United Nations on Globalization, and External Advisor to the World Trade Organization. Professor Bhagwati has published more than 300 articles and has authored and edited over 50 volumes. He also writes frequently for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times. Professor Bhagwati is often described as one of the most creative international trade theorists of his generation and is a leader in the fight for freer trade. His most recent book, In Defense of Globalization, has contributed to this worldwide debate and discussion on globalization. In 1971, Professor Bhagwati founded the Journal of International Economics, which is the top academic journal in the field of international economics. He's a fellow of the Econometric Society, was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and was the Vice President of the American Economics Association. He holds several honorary degrees, including from Erasmus University in the Netherlands, University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. Professor Bhagwati is an American citizen, we've just learned, but a native of India. He graduated from Cambridge University in 1956, then studied at MIT and Oxford, returning to India in 1961 as Professor of Economics at the Indian Statistical Institute, and then moving on to the Delhi School of Economics. He returned to MIT in 1968, leaving it 12 years later to become the Ford International Professor of Economics at Columbia University. I'd like to conclude this introduction with some brief remarks his wife, Columbia University Professor Padma Desai, gave on the occasion of his 70th birthday. She says in her remarks that when her husband comes into the room, the sun comes out. She notes that each published piece is almost always a first draft, hot off the griddle with few corrections, and that there's no time to be lost for the next idea, with a new analytical design and a fresh policy wrinkle. When interviewed by the Chronicle of Higher Education about Professor Bhagwati, she described him as Werner Heisenberg's particle. Now, you'll recall that under Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, one could determine a particle's location or velocity precisely, but not both. Professor Bhagwati is often on the move, and indeed came here virtually directly from London, where he participated in an intergovernmental meeting on trade policy. So with this brief introduction, it's my distinct pleasure to turn the floor to Professor Jagdish Bhagwati to present the 2009 Harold Goodhue Vodder Memorial Lecture, and he'll take questions after his presentation. Professor Bhagwati.
Okay, Dean Kaiser, Professor Bluffstone, the economics faculty, and friends. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I particularly am glad to honor the memory of Professor Vater and to have Mrs. Vater here as well. He's clearly a man I would have, treated as a role model. He was not merely a great scholar, but he also dirtied his hands and went into the administration at a very important time in our career of our history, in the history of our nation, at a time when we had the previous Great Depression. So it's a real privilege for me to be here. But what I do want to talk about is free trade, because that's also one of the important issues which I think is before us and will always be before us, because protectionism is a bit like, scotching it is a bit like stamping out New York's cockroaches. It's a hopeless task, and if you are a free trader, it's a vacation for life. Often I think of writing books on other subjects when there's something else which comes up again, a new form of protectionism. And so it becomes a preoccupation and an occupation. I want to talk about free trade both from a long-run point of view and the current situation. But the long-run point of view, namely whether free trade is good or bad, remains an important issue. And I think I just want to say a few things on that before I get on to what faces President Obama, whose problems are more acute than just facing protectionism. But I think I'll come to that in a short while. First, on the long view, which I think is important to get at, I think the G20 meetings repeatedly said that trade was good, that an open economy was good. And by open economy, they meant just trade, not just trade alone, but also immigration, jobs, in terms of not being able to, or not wanting to discriminate against foreigners. So you would not want to just fire foreigners first and hire them last, something which is happening in a lot of OECD countries. It also includes foreign investment, for example, because people like President Sarkozy have said that French firms should not merely be not investing abroad, but if they're investing abroad, they should come back to France. And even President Obama has more or less said, with a little guardedness, that we ought to change rules so that firms don't in fact go away from, say, Boston to Bangalore in India. He definitely used the word Bangalore, which I think is not, which comes close to my heart. Boston, I'm not sure, I just made that up. It was an alliteration of B and B. And I was a bit struck by the fact that he chose Bangalore at a time when India and US have to get along and strike compromises on the Doha round. But anyway, those are wider issues, and I think one of the good things about the G20 communique in London a few weeks ago was that they referred to openness of the world economy and not just to trade protectionism. And I think that wider point of view I won't be able to get into. I just wanted to mention that that is really part of the liberal economic order of which free trade is a part. Now, let me just say that while neither President Obama nor Gordon Brown, Prime Minister, really forcefully said that free trade was good, I think they could have said it. And the reason why they should have said it is that if you look at the post-war period, this undoubtedly it's a period of unprecedented prosperity. Let me take the rich countries. The rich countries actually went into gradual liberalization of trade, of foreign investment, and even capital account convertibility, but that took much longer. But these were ways in which we were dismantling the barriers which we had inherited from the war in the earlier period. And that was really something which was accompanied by, I would say, which led to, because causality is something different from just association, but I think lots of studies have shown that in fact it was a cause of an unprecedented prosperity. Now in real life, of course, there are all kinds of extraneous circumstances which arise. So in 1973, this process was interrupted by the fact that in 1973, as you remember, OPEC succeeded and this price of oil went up 7-fold. Now, no economist can absorb a price rise or in terms of trade deterioration, as we economists call it, of that order. So we went into a tailspin at that point. And then Paul Volcker came in and he purged the economy of the resulting consequences with a very tough policy of deflation. So we had 70s and 80s sort of interrupting this. And this is the way of economics. Nothing proceeds exponentially or smoothly forever. And so we then resumed our growth after that. So I'm not a knee-jerk ideological peddler of prosperity doctrine, but I just want to say that except for this particular phenomenon, which lasted almost 2 decades, we really had unprecedented prosperity. What about the poor countries, or the developing countries as they are called? In the poor countries, there was great skepticism about the international economy. It included skepticism about international integration of the national economy. The standard line was that integration into the world economy will lead to disintegration of the national economy. So ironically, while today our unions and many of our fearful anti-trade lobbies and public opinion, the way they worry about trade and its effect on your national well-being, those kinds of worries were actually the preserve of the poor countries. The poor countries actually thought that they could not possibly integrate into the world economy without a malign impact on their economies, that the economies would disintegrate. For example, how could poor, famished workers possibly, without infrastructure, without proper governance, to be able to guide and provide the infrastructure, how could they possibly compete with people in this country or in the West who had a historical evolution of institutions, of infrastructure, of good tax policies, better fed workers, and so on. And so the fear was that we would really not be able to compete with these. Well, of course we did in the end. The countries which really did not fall for this actually found that they benefited very considerably. Among these were the Far Eastern economies for sure, the Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And we often, those of us who were still skeptical kept saying, well, these were special cases. These are city-states like Hong Kong and Singapore. Korea is small. It doesn't really amount to a hill of beans and so on. It's very much like the argument that Cuba is like the Hong Kong of the communist world. It doesn't tell you anything at all. So we always look for special cases, special arguments to say it doesn't really apply to us, but it didn't really sort of work in. And what really worked was the fact that for almost 3 decades, countries which are inward-looking and which actually refused to use markets at all, and we had knee-jerk market, anti-market, anti-market fundamentalism, nothing was left to be done with markets at all. Everywhere there was knee-jerk intervention, to the point where Adam Smith's invisible hand was nowhere to be seen in many of these countries. And that, combined with a real fear of international integration, these were the 2 main forces which led to about 3 decades lost to low growth rates in India, China in particular, but also in Ghana, Egypt, Brazil, and so on and so forth. Once this model had been seen to be unproductive, even counterproductive, people shifted away from these into looking at these precisely integration of the world markets and greater resort to markets as 2 ways in which we really wanted to improve the performance of the world economy, of your national economies. And that has actually happened. After we did this, after we went through these reforms in India and in China in particular, you had a huge impact on the growth rates. They more than doubled in each case. Now, that is characterized by, that is what unprecedented prosperity meant. But then, of course, we have to worry also about another issue, which actually was very much in our minds when we were thinking about development in the 50s, which was, what about poverty? Because GNP growth is an aggregate, right? It's overall prosperity. But what about distribution of income? What about poverty in particular, the poverty of the bottom 30%? When I went back to India from Oxford, the first job I was given in the Indian Planning Commission was how to bring up the bottom 30% to a minimum standard of living. I need not tell you that I couldn't possibly have the answer. But one thing we did settle on was that rapid growth was the only answer, the principal answer, not the only answer, but the principal answer, that you had to grow the pie, this horrible American expression, that there was no way we could really redistribute income. One of my friends, a communist friend who returned to Poland, Professor Kielecki, who actually independently discovered some of Keynes's contributions, and he's a great economist. But he told me when he was in India in 1962, and I was assisting him with his work, he told me, Bhagwati, the problem with your country is that there are too many exploited and too few exploiters, by which he meant that you just couldn't redistribute your income and get out of it, because the poverty problem was immense. And so we had to think of sustainable, that's a fashionable phrase now. I hope nobody talks about sustainable losses as well, or sustainable decline. But in any case, that's the in word right now. Whatever you talk about is actually sustainable. In the early days when I was young, socialism was the in word. And then came the liberal international economic order. So today, you have to ask, what exactly do you mean by sustainable? So now I'll be using it in different senses. But basically, the argument was that you could not have redistribution as a sustainable policy for impact on poverty. You really had to be growing the pie. We never could test that proposition because we never had the growth till as long as the policy framework was inward-looking, autarkic, and did not want to use markets at all in any way. Massive expansion of public sector without rhyme or reason being one of them. So I think as soon as we changed the policies, then systems began to grow. And then we had a final test as to whether, in fact, we could really impact poverty. Because until that point, we could not, because the growth strategy, while embraced in principle, had been sabotaged by the fact that there was no growth because of the bad policy framework. So policy framework is extremely important. When we changed the policy, we got something like 6.5% rate of growth as against 3.5% for 25 years. And then in the last 20 years, we've had about 6.5%. And then finally, and China, it's even greater. And then about 500 million people in the two countries, according to most estimates, have been brought up above the poverty line. So the strategy really worked. And I call it the pull-up strategy. I mean, I've always called it the pull-up, meaning an activist, radical strategy of pulling people up out of poverty into gainful employment. I mean, in the West, thanks to Mrs. Thatcher and Reagan and our liberal assaults, I'm a Democrat, our liberal assaults on the Reaganite, Thatcher kind of framework that is a trickle-down process. I think that's just a passive approach, like you're seeing a movie about the Earl of Nottingham, and here are these English lords, with the legs of mutton in their mouths and so on, and eating away merrily, and some crumbs fall to the serfs and the dogs below the table. That's not the strategy we had in mind as growth. It was an active strategy where we're going to mobilize all kinds of policy frameworks, including aid, including raising domestic savings, including, finally, a good policy framework to actually have the system accelerate and really get into an impact on power. So when people tell you, I mean, the people who oppose things like freer trade, things like markets, they always talk in terms of essentially saying that it's a trickle-down, and they do not really appreciate the fact that it's really a pull-up strategy. It's an active, radical policy. It's not a conservative, let the crumbs fall kind of strategy. And it has worked. So today you'll find again in relation, many of these people saying, but the distribution of income hasn't really changed. They're wrong on that too. It's not just growth, but growth is an instrument through which you have actually impacted on poverty. And that needs to be clearly understood. But what about the rich countries? In rich countries, the unions in particular are extremely worried, and particularly in the United States, that they fear that trade with the poor countries is producing poor in the rich countries, i.e. the trading with poor countries like China, India, Mexico, whatever, any trade. Even little Panama is held up in the U.S. Congress. I mean, Panama, it's got to be a joke to worry about that, right? But that's what they do worry. And poor President Obama, who had promised to bring it before the Congress, just last week, I'm told, while I was in Russia and London, has actually withdrawn it, leaving poor Max Baucus twisting in the air, I'm told. But I haven't really looked it up. I just heard it as I was boarding the plane for here. That is the situation where the slightest bit of any kind of trade sends poor AFL-CIO into a trauma. Now, if you do that, then of course, if you believe that, then of course you're going to be against trade, and particularly with the poor countries. Now, I'm a Democrat, and and I know many Democrats think Republicans are devils with horns who read the Wall Street Journal, and at best are closet. Even if they are not, they're really closet reactionaries. Actually, Democrats are supposed to be cosmopolitan, altruistic, by contrast. At least that's their self-image. Now, as soon as poor countries begin to export successfully and to grow out of poverty, we start, as Democrats, try to raise the bar against them. What is it going to do to our, state of mind? We're going to be, in a complete state of dissonance, because we're supposed to be for the poor countries and for the poor people, and at the same time, as soon as they start exporting their way out of poverty, among other policies, we want to raise the barriers. And so how do we do that? So I expect that pretty soon the psychiatric offices in New York are going to fill up with Democrats, because this is really an extremely difficult situation to be in. And the tragedy is that there's not even evidence. This is an unnecessary cancer being inflicted on oneself, because if you go and look for the empirical argumentation as to whether, in fact, trade with the poor countries has really affected our workers' wages, because as you all know, for about 25 years there's been stagnation, and that's a real problem. But is it due to, is the cause the trade with the poor countries? And while my great student Paul Krugman has tried desperately to establish that this is so because Paul has gotten into an attack mode on the Republicans since the Bush era and would like to support anything that we Democrats say, more or less psychologically. So he's tried hard to produce evidence, but without success. And in fact, most of the empirical arguments or empirical studies show that in fact the pressure on the workers' wages is coming from very rapid and acute technological change, which is displacing the demand, unskilled labor and replacing it with demand for skilled labor. So I won't go into that in detail, but that is the state of the empirical evidence. And if anything, trade with the poor countries, from which we get a number of labor-intensive goods, which enter the consumption of the poor particularly intensively, that this is in fact moderating the fall in wages which would have been brought about by the technical change. So if anything, the message is one which is benign rather than malign impact as far as the poor countries are concerned. But this is something which we need to face up to. Unfortunately, President Obama, he can't read everything. He reads much more than President Bush, but that's not saying anything. He hasn't obviously faced up to this, and he goes around, therefore, buying into a prescription for what I call export protectionism. Namely, supposing a beast is charging at you, you can try and stop it by catching it by the horn, right? I mean, I can't, but you can. Now, another way to do it is to reach behind the beast, catch it by the tail, and break the charge. So there are two ways in which you can moderate competition. One through conventional import protection, which is actually hard to get these days because we've succeeded so far in being able to make it a bad word. So nobody likes to be called a protection, which is actually a measure of victory. And at least something to be said on our side. But what do? Essentially, the AFL-CIO and the unsuspecting President Obama, I mean, he's a great policy wonk, but all policy wonks cannot be universal policy wonks. There are some areas of darkness in each of them. So what he's bought into is that we should get the foreign countries, the poor countries, to accept our labor standards, our domestic environmental standards. The idea being, of course, not altruistic, because what do they care really about what happens to our workers in India and so on? If they did, they would say, come over here, right? We don't say that. I mean, I'm hitting below the belt a little bit, but still. It's a good game. I know lots of union leaders myself. It's not that I'm sleeping with the enemy. I'm friendly to the unions, genuinely. And I've never crossed a picket line in my life. I'm 75. Our generation never did. So once I was talking with John Sweeney, John Sweeney, who is an Irishman without the Irish humor or the gift of the gab. And so I said, I've never crossed a picket line. So he looked at me, and so I said, and it's not because I never encountered one. I have encountered picket lines, but I don't cross picket lines. But I said, look, if you say you're being altruistic and wanting labor standards for countries like mine, and I don't believe you. It sounds like maybe that's what you think. But I said, let me ask you a question. Supposing they have lower standards than you have, wouldn't you say that that's unfair competition? They all say that. Within 5 minutes, even if you don't ask them, they'll say that's unfair competition. And I said, that is your self-interest, because you're worried about competition. If you're just talking about Mars, where little, green men are forcing little green children into working, and we have no trade with them, we may have planetary empathy, right? And we may say, look, this shouldn't be done. We'll probably send you, bomb the hell out of you if you do this. But that would be truly altruistic, right? But in this case, it's always tied up with this unfair competition. And so nothing wrong with being self-interested, and being worried about your welfare. But please spare us, putting on my Indian hat, the pretense that you're doing it for our workers. Please. cut the crap, as they say, in New York, not in Washington. So I think this is the real problem that we run into, and friends of mine like Professor Stiglitz, who always believes we are hypocrites beyond the point of belief. But I think in this case, it is in fact something which really creates a problem. And President Obama simply hasn't understood the issue, in my opinion. So he's buying into export protectionism, because export protectionism means getting the other guys to undertake actions which will moderate the competition. And I want to emphasize that there's nothing wrong with self-interest. I mean, if you know your Rabbi Hillel, I mean, he's put it very well, that if I'm not for others, what am I? And if I'm not for myself, who will be? Right? And so we are a mix of altruism and self-interest. I have nothing wrong. I mean, I don't look down on people who have some element of self-interest. But just be honest. And this is what it is. And I think this is why I think President Obama will have to get off that, because it is protectionist. And I think this is coming from this misdiagnosis to begin with of what is it that's causing the pressure on our wages. And so I'll just say that much about it. So if I was, I never will be, one of the prime ministers or presidents at a G20 meeting, I would forcefully say that an open economy has led to unprecedented prosperity, both in rich and poor countries, and it has led to enormous impact on poverty in the poor countries, and it has actually done nothing to harm the workers in our countries. Therefore, we have nothing to be ashamed of in relation to free trade, and free trade is extremely important as a policy we want to embrace. You never got that. You only got the prosperity part. You never got the discussion of it, because it was just one little paragraph in the communique. And then they went on to other things. Okay, so I think that's the first thing I want to say on the long view, that all evidence, all empirical evidence, it's not just armchair theorizing, shows that both on prosperity and on distributional grounds, this is a great policy to have. And you can celebrate it, get a real high-quality champagne to celebrate it, not just a cheap substitute. Okay, how do we put this across, all right? And that is a real issue, because it's all very well for us to talk in circles like this, or even at G20 in little bits and snippets about it, but how do you actually put it across? And that's a big problem. It is a big problem with every policy which needs some intellectual effort to put across. If you look at, I mean, I'm envious of the people who are on the green movement. As long as my colleague Jim Hansen, the great scientist of climate change, as long as he was talking about the IPCC studies and so on and so forth, well, it was like us economists on trade talking about the great value of trade. In his case, it was a great fear of the cataclysmic change that was coming with global warming. But it never really had an impact until one thing happened, or in fact, three things happened. First, the glaciers started melting. Two, the polar bears were in trouble. And three, that famous film of the French film on the penguins. These were things which immediately registered with people. And then on top of that, finally came Al Gore's own movie. But that was the last sort of act. Even if it hadn't happened, these three things would have really been decisive. So I'm trying to think, and I just throw it out to you. If you can think of something similar for trade, I'll be most delighted. That's hard. Actually, we only have a negative example, which is the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Because in 1930, the Smoot-Hawley tariff was passed unanimously, which also shows that bipartisan consensus in the Congress is no guarantor of virtue. It can be behind something pretty awful as well. So you have to be careful. But in any case, that was passed. And after that, nuclear winter broke out in terms of first tit-for-tat retaliation, and then also there was some bit of what I call monkey see, monkey do. You are doing it, so I do it. And so there was a huge proliferation of trade barriers around them. Now, that is the one thing we can point to. And this is why I was a little upset when Paul Krugman said, well, maybe it didn't amount to a hill of beans or something. And that's not true, actually, because the onus of proof must be on those who say it didn't amount to anything when you see a massive proliferation. I don't have to say that this caused some consequences. If you say it didn't, then I think the proof belongs, onus of proof belongs to you. In any case, to try and knock the Smoot-Hawley tariff, post-tariff retaliations on spread of trade barriers is to really be antisocial, in my view, because this is our only example. If you remember, I mean, those of you who are older will remember the Gore-Ross Perot debate on trade, and Perot had come completely unprepared, but Al Gore put down the picture of Smoot and Hawley right in front. Actually, it was from my book on protectionism, because my student Doug Irwin had dug it out from the library. It's not easy to get the picture of those two criminals, as it were. Not criminals, they were just misguided. and so that concretized what you would, for the people in general. So what you need is concrete examples, anecdotes, and so on. And the reason why many of us have failed is if you listen to large numbers of people, they'll say, oh, the gains from trade from Doha round or from any liberalization is going to be so many $1 trillion and so on. But God knows. I mean, nobody knows. These numbers are very fragile. It all depends on what you put into a large model and so on. It doesn't carry any weight. Besides, if you tell me $1 trillion, well, now it may mean something after the TARP, etc., after the current crisis. $1 trillion, at least I know how to spell it now. But what does it mean in relation to anything with, you have to compare it with something, put it against something for your brain to start functioning, even if you're an intelligent professor. It's not an oxymoron. There are intelligent professors. So you just have these numbers being trotted out, and they amount to nothing. Simple examples would do. So one of the things which I'm working on my next book, and I'm looking at how many, in each state there are so many people who export, actually, so many industries and firms. The gains you get from that can be quantified, and besides, you can have pictures of factories, workers, who have gained. That's the only way to do it, frankly. That's the only way to do it. But we have to give some thought to how we sell something which is intellectually convincing to us, but not to the population. So I think that has been totally lacking in trade, in my judgment, and I think we need to get back to it. Next point, which I think is equally important, as long as you say even if you bring in workers, poverty, and so on, which are social justice issues, I mean, the way we normally define social justice, so there's some element of that. But if you look at 19th century history, there's a beautiful book by Frank Trentman called The Free Trade Nation, where he says, and I wasn't aware of that until I read the book, that in the 19th century England, it wasn't just Adam Smith or the fact that the Brits really thought they would win. Because one reason why politicians are very keen on trade, the only time when they are very keen on trade is when they think in this Darwinian process their own country will win. And this is one reason why Little Bush, George W., and Ronald Reagan, both of whom believed in America's great ability to compete, they were in fact real free traders. Britain was a free trader to a large extent because it was ahead of the curve, it was ahead of innovation and so on. We were free traders after the war because everybody else had been finished by the war. They had to get up again, and we would emerge as victors. So there's some element of that, the fact that you will behave like a statesman when as a politician you believe that your country is going to compete successfully. Now, that is certainly part of it. But more than that, in the 19th century, and I'll bring it up to date here for US, people really believed that this was free trade would lead to justice, fairness, peace. It wasn't Adam Smith's case, which was really the compelling issue. There were things which were beyond economic prosperity, which people were talking about. So it was a social value or a moral value beyond the economics. And that I hadn't realized. Now, when you look at what happened under Roosevelt, Cordell Hull was his Secretary of State. And none of you will remember, I mean, he was a great free trader. And it is hard to believe today for free traders like me that he could get the Nobel Peace Prize for trade. He did. Today, all you get is rotten eggs and tomatoes and pies in your face if you talk about free trade. So the world has changed. But now I went and looked back at the cartoons, etc., during the period, and the incredible cartoons at the time around Cordell Hull. There's one of Chinese-style acrobats, but of course Occidental acrobats, American, I guess. It's a Herb Block cartoon where there's a protectionist trying to push off through a pole the guy at the bottom, who is the acrobat who is marked free trade. And then there's above him called fairness, and above him is an acrobat called peace. It's unthinkable that anybody would think like that today. There are plenty of cartoons like that at the time. So even for us and for Cordell Hull, if you go and read his speeches, it is related to peace. And I think those of you who know the EU well, European Union, it may be a special case, but the European Union, certainly the motivation and its success so far has been in burying the hatchet between warring countries like France and Germany. Whether it will sustain, I don't know. But the point is, that is exactly what these guys were talking about. So we've got to bring that element back into the picture and try and seize the higher moral ground. Because as long as we just talk about peace and about prosperity or even about workers' wages, it's not going to go that far in my job. It'll go a certain distance, particularly with the tricks I was suggesting, of how to sell it. But I think this is something which we have to rise above it, because what happened in recent years was that all the young groups, people into environment, people into gender issues and so on, automatically assumed that somehow free trade was for special interests, businessmen, professors captured by businessmen. I don't know. I mean, I have no idea. I think some of them may have talked like that, and so on. That we in economics used to say that trade is a general interest, and the special interests like trade, business lobbies, etc., asked for protection. So we were on higher moral ground even within economics. Suddenly we find ourselves on lower moral ground because all the young groups are saying, we are dealing with really important issues. You guys are just talking about things which multinationals, etc., are interested in. So I think we have to get back onto higher moral ground. And one way to do it, of course, is to go back to the peace idea, as among other things, and the social justice on workers and so on. But one more thing, which is that when I was in Seattle in 1999, when the whole thing went up in flames in the WTO ministerial meeting, at that time, all the young people, everybody under the sun was marching there and preventing, and led to the disruption of the meeting at which the first WTO multilateral round of negotiations was going to be declared. And none of us were even allowed to, the militant groups were so strong that you really even could get past them to the hall to discuss anything. And there was a bomb threat at that time in a big opening session on which I was. And it was postponed to the afternoon. And many of the ministers were kind of squeamish and were wondering whether they should go even in the afternoon. Would they have cleared up the bomb threat altogether? And I said, what kind of believers are you in free trade? Don't you want to die in the cause? And they thought I was crazy. But I was just teasing them. If you believe in something, expose yourself to risk. But anyway, so there, everybody was agitated. And then I discovered, because I interacted with them, I was debating Ralph Nader in the town hall and things like that. But then I went to the streets being a professor, and most of the people were young. And so I was talking with them, and and I discovered that they were really worried about the social issues. They were worried about women's issues, they were worried about environment, they were worried about poverty in the poor countries, they were worried about child labor, about the state of democracy being undermined and so on by extensive integration of the world. So then I wrote a book after coming back called In Defense of Globalization. I was going to say globalization has a human face, because these are social issues which I think can be described as having as aspects of a human face. That's what Tony Blair and Bill Clinton and Gerhard Schroeder were talking about. The third way, if you remember, which I've called the only way, but they didn't have smart advisors, obviously, so on using the right language. But that was really what they were into. And then I went through each of these things in my book called In Defense of Globalization in 2004, and argued under each rubric, each topic, that in fact, on balance, we are actually better off advancing these social agendas rather than handicapping them. Like on gender issues, on equality of pay, which I'm sure would concern half the audience here, if not, it's probably greater than half. Equal pay for equal work. Now, there are three ways you can think about it. One is, like in the university, you have identical degrees, identical experience. You can certainly compare what you're getting as a woman is against what a man of equal qualification gets. It's reasonably objective. Then there is a sort of British European approach where you determine subjectively what a woman working in one part of the government should be paid compared to a man working in something completely different. Europeans do that, but I think that's cockeyed. I mean, it's just completely arbitrary, and it does. And the third, of course, is the mega effect, which is that even if you're paid the same wage in every occupation, women tend to go into lower paid occupations, all right? So there are three ways of looking at equality, which is also a reason why you don't want equality for women's pay to be in something like a WTO document, because it has to be interpreted for your own society, which is the interpretation you like. It's not unambiguous, all right? So you can have it as a general principle, but it doesn't really kick into the kind of things you want. Now, if you take equality of pay for the same people, in the book I describe a paper where I take Gary Becker's hypothesis, which is that if I'm a man and you're a woman, and we're both equally qualified, and if I'm being paid twice as much as you are, well, when the going gets tough, every penny counts, and paying me more for the same work is obviously inefficient. So when you are in a traded industry, that's the hypothesis, where the competition is fierce, then you'll find the differential narrowing faster than in other industries due to other reasons, all right? So less men will be demanded, more women will be demanded until there will be some equalizing tendency. So these two women, students of Larry Katz at Harvard, actually found for a 20-year period in the United States that the differential had narrowed a little faster between men and women's pay in the traded industries rather than the non. So this is a blow for trade, all right? Contrary to what people believe. So I go through a variety of such arguments and so on. So I would say that is something, again, which shows that globalization, or certainly trade element of it, is actually good for even social agenda. So that's, again, standing on higher ground, because young people naturally fear all this. They hear about these things from other people. I mean, they're young. And, a lot of people capture them, actually, I find, to do all sorts of things. I see little kids outside Staples, 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds, talking about rainforests and all sorts of things, and not to do this and to boycott Staples. I doubt if they're anything better than child soldiers, because at that age. But children are used In fact, children were marching in Seattle instead of going to school during, carrying placards against child labor. So anyway, the point is, on social grounds also, you can say that actually we are on higher moral ground. So I would say if you go around all these issues where you may want to look at free trade in a much wider framework, we do come out ahead. And there's nothing to be embarrassed about, and I would be very forceful. So when you teach in classes or in discussions, trade, don't just concentrate on GNP. I mean, that's a kiss of death because, it's important, but it's, young people are just not interested. And people have wider points of view, morality in several different dimensions, and I think we come out ahead, in my view, generally speaking. Okay, so now I come to Obama. Obama's problem, I think, and so I'll just be very brief so we can have a little time for discussion. President Obama has the problem that he's inherited a Democratic Congress from the last election, which is extremely hostile to trade. Democrats have been going in that direction quite a while. If you look at the Democratic votes for trade bills, it's been steadily going downhill in terms of the number of Democrats who are voting. There's a little bit of that among the Republicans, but among Democrats it's much more acute. And the last bunch of Democrats, including Sherrod Brown, etc., got elected with union support. And unfortunately, the unions are fearful of international trade. So that gets reflected into what the congressmen want, and what congressmen want gets reflected into what the president wants. So it's a kind of real constraint on the president. Even if he was, in fact, convinced by all these arguments, I doubt if anybody has ever told him about all these arguments. But I think basically he's not an anti-trade person. That's what people who know him say. I've never heard him make a very strong statement in favor of freer trade. So it's just a benign expression of, goodwill towards a president who is really quite remarkable in several other ways. But I could not honestly say that I can give you chapter and verse about what a strong guy he is in wanting freer trade. So part of the reason has to be that he feels constrained. Two, his advisors are deeply constrained by a variety of other factors, including the fact that you can't, even in the Obama or even in the Clinton administrations, not just the Bush administration, can get any advancement if you take on, in this particular administration, the unions, which are very strong for the reasons that I mentioned. So you're going to keep yourself quiet. I know two people who are very high up who never said anything at all. One doesn't need confirmation, the other one is awaiting it, and they're not ever going to express themselves on these issues because it imperils them. I can be independent because I have no political aspiration, all right? It's not that I'm a better man, but it's just that I don't expect anything, and nobody wants to give me anything. My greatest compliment was when I became economic policy advisor to the Director General of the GATT in '91. So I asked him, I said, did you clear my appointment with the Indian government or with the American one? Because in '92 I changed nationality, but I'm still considered Indian by many people. So he said neither, because both would have said no. And I think that's the best compliment I ever got in my life. So, but as I said, I have tenure, and I use that to advantage. Many other people have to worry about their occupation and so on. So I don't consider myself to be morally superior. But there is nobody in the administration who's pushing for it. And the Democrats are, unfortunately, constraining the president. And that is something he has to worry about. I told you about that history, but actually, if you see the vote by which, or the majority vote by which we have managed to pass trade bills, it has been very, very thin, extremely thin. Now, in fact, the last one went in by 2 votes. The one before I forget the exact, there have been so many votes, by one vote. So I was telling my students, I said, how not to use statistics. I said, you can't say that because the majority by which the trade bill is passed has gone up from 1 to 2, it's not 100% improvement. It's still precariously thin. And the president can't afford to ignore that. So I think we face a real constraint as far as he's concerned. I don't know which way it's going to develop. But right now, because of the crisis, he's in still greater trouble. Because there are two things you need to distinguish, and I'll stop there. One is moving forward on trade, i.e. trade liberalization, which is the Doha round currently, okay, multilateral trade negotiations. There are also these FTAs, which are kind of sideshows to some extent, and they raise other issues. But the main one is Doha, the big multilateral negotiation. And the second problem is, how do you prevent sliding back into protectionism? So that's called sliding back. The first one is called moving forward. So we say we should move forward, and on sliding back, we should stand still. And only trade people can both move forward and stand still at the same time. But that's our aspiration. Now, on moving back, the president, unfortunately, is actually surrendering too much by American provisions, the bailout plan, which is sector-specific to autos, which violates, again, the commitment at the WTO. So we are flouting the rule of law, which is really something we need to worry about. Other kinds of protectionism, where we're simply asserting our rights to be able to, vary tariffs, use anti-dumping actions, use safeguard, that's a different kettle of fish. And tomorrow in the Financial Times, I have a piece coming out on the distinction between the two. But where I really worry about the president is that he's not shown enough imagination and courage to say we will not flout the rule of law, and that we'll take the lead in preventing people like Sarkozy and others from moving in that direction as well. But the president has sort of been wobbly, weak, and so on. In terms of moving forward, the last thought is very hard. In a time of depression, I don't know of any historical example, maybe there is one or two, where in the middle of a macroeconomic recession, a democratic country manages to liberalize trade, because people become very risk-averse during that. So I don't really expect anything from him except good noises and just keeping it on the shelf, the Doha round, until a more propitious time after we have fixed the whole thing. But he really, that is where I think the president will have to be prudent, because if he also expends a lot of energy doing something which is not doable at all, after all, there's just so much political goodwill you have. So while I'm a great supporter of the multilateral trading system, I think he needs to cool the rhetoric there and elevate the rhetoric against sliding back into protectionism. And I think, that's what I would basically think he ought to be doing. I personally think he is not going to be able to do very much on trade. I think his major mistake is to think he can put it off until later. You see, when President Clinton came in for 1 year, he'd come in on Japan bashing. In the Silicon Valley, they were worried about Japan's rise. So 1 year he wasted just on bashing Japan, and because all his staff thought he would want to bash Japan. He's not a basher at all. He's an unabashed non-basher. I mean, he likes to be loved. It's not the principle. It's his temperament. I mean, if you like to be loved, you don't use the stick, right? You persuade people. So he's a multilateralist by temperament, not by intellectual conviction. And so that's what he was. But after 1 year of dilly-dallying and wasting time on Japan bashing by his staff and so on, he then discovered religion, as it were, on trade. And he fought like a lion for NAFTA and for Uruguay round. So he had a year during which it was hard to make out what the hell he stood for, because he was always ambivalent and so on. And at one side said the problem with George Bush, the father, was, that you could not read his lips. The problem with President Clinton was that you didn't know whether to read his upper lip or his lower lip. because he was really torn. But he finally cleared up the mess. And the same thing with President Bush Jr. He came in and he immediately used the steel tariffs. But then he fought against them, and after a year, he got out. The trouble about poor President Obama is he doesn't have that year to work his equilibrium out, because the bailout already contains trade measures like Buy America and so on. So he cannot really wait for a year. In the meantime, he can do untold damage to the system. And so I think this is the only thing that worries me about is, I mean, he cannot go sequentially. And I'm not making a Warren Buffett-like point, because Warren Buffett says, don't do healthcare, don't do this and that, you're overloading this. I'm not saying overloading this. I'm saying you cannot distinguish. I mean, you cannot say trade policy will be done later, because it's already inside your macroeconomic solution for, say, solving the crisis, and including the way you're using top funds and saying you shouldn't hire foreigners and you shouldn't do. So all of these things are part of what we are doing to fix the fiscal crisis and the macroeconomic crisis, the Main Street crisis, and the Wall Street crisis. So he cannot really say, I'll do it later. It just is not doable. And that is another source of worry, aside from the fact that how does he get the Democrats to move in the right direction? But he's a great, I mean, I wouldn't give him any advice on the politics of it. After all, he's the one man who's done incredible things on the political side for me as an economist, and particularly a professor, to suggest how he might handle the politics of all this would be a bit crazy, right? I mean, because he's handled politics pretty well. No one, and hopefully he doesn't make his mistake for the first time on trade. Thank you.
Doctor, thank you very much for your presentation. There's an archaic term called political economy.
Yeah.
And you've referenced a number of issues, and I'm just wondering, two things shaping the Obama trade policy. If we needed a villain on trade to be protectionist against, it would be China. And for a variety of reasons, we've been very modest in any comments in that direction. The other point I wanted to just comment on was, isn't Obama better off engaging free trade a little bit more if we have a decent national health care arrangement? Thanks, sir.
No, I think let me take the second one first, because I think you're absolutely right. I think the way I look at it is that certainly healthcare is useful and necessary. Adjustment assistance has already been amplified. It passed last week or the week before. So we have so many items are tradable now, including services. It's not just haircuts, which you do in the local barber, but these are tradable services. So the number of items which have become tradable has increased remarkably. So we need to pull in the services which we have now, and there are variations on what we can do on top of just giving standard adjustment assistance. So that part is done, and we need that. And healthcare certainly we need, though I think that's going to be a bigger problem, because just today there was a report about the American Medical Association holding up, or saying that they're going to fight the public provision of insurance to the uninsured. And I mean, I had expected that, because the American Medical Association is a lobby. And throughout the world, if you do anything to increase their earnings, like bringing in, if say you're indigent and I bring you into coverage, and you pay me, and a doctor insurance company private, that improves my earnings, right? Other things being given. But if they do it in a way where they're introducing a public sector rival to me, that is something I'm going to be against. So medical associations have always been against National Health Service kind of reform, and they've been always in favor of wherever the ability to pay is improved. And I was not surprised at all that this happened. And it'll be interesting to see how President Obama, who wants to change lobbying as we knew it, is going to handle this. I haven't seen any evidence that he will, because like, again, trade in international medical services, I've got several articles on that, but I can't get anybody in the administration to take even a look at it, because it can save you enormous sums of money by exporting patients, importing doctors, doing all kinds of outsourcing, because that the American Medical Association is fearful about it, but not one economist or medical expert in the administration will ever respond to that, and I don't know why. Maybe they're not reading anything, I have no idea. They're going for technocratic solutions like, from which the returns will be much less. So, but I won't touch China because there's so many dimensions to it. But let me just say one thing. What you want to do about the economy and about the working class and about the institutional adjustments depends on your view of what the modern economy is. And my view is that it's characterized by great volatility, partly because of continuous and acute technical change, which I talked about, but also because of international trade. But it's not international trade coming in from the poor countries. It is a fact that there's so many players today, and the degree of comparative advantage has shrunk. So it's not like in Adam Smith's time, people in Haifa didn't worry about oranges being grown in greenhouses in Edinburgh because the cost difference was so enormous. You felt comfortable. Today, it's all cheek by jowl, all kinds of, you ask any CEO, there's somebody breathing down his or her neck from somewhere. It could be Brazil, it could be China, it could be Taiwan, it could be Poland, it could even, any country at all. And that is true of virtually everybody. So everybody feels like they are, Maria Callas, who might drop a note at the Met, and with Renata Tebaldi waiting in the wings to take her place. So people are on their toes all the time. So there's an enormous sense of volatility in the system of jobs for almost everybody. And that being the case, I think you have to rethink your entire institutional framework. It's the opposite of what the Soviets had, where everything was kind of, given. It was all going downhill at the same time, but it was not variations among them. It was almost like, Roman troops led by, in a particular way. But you didn't have. Now there's so much change going on that, like, for instance, you have to have, like, if there's outsourcing of radiology, which is not true, incidentally. Not one radiologist has lost his job or her job. There are many more women radiologists than men. It was just a scare. But, scares, again, play a big role. But supposing if they'd lost their jobs, then you have a whole lot of new jobs coming up due to the obesity epidemic, right? You've got liposuction, you've got diabetes, you've got hepatitis B. There's huge numbers of jobs. But today, I'm told, if a radiologist were to go all the way down and then start working their way up into a new specialty. So why can't we have optimal trajectories of transition? Or if you've got to have a lot of flux, you may lose job in Boeing, but there are transplants like Nissan and Honda who are doing well. So you should be able to move from autos into, or rather from aircraft into autos, which means you should have more generalized training relative to specialized training in the college. So once you start thinking, if this is, my view is correct, there's a whole institutional agenda other than just medical care and so on, which we need to look at. So that's what I'm writing about. Like, what has changed? It's a new age, in my opinion. And part of it does involve international trade. because the gains from trade, the flip side of it is in fact volatility. And you really have to pay attention to it and rethink your entire system. So that is really the burden of what I'm trying to develop. And I don't see anybody in the administration thinking in more sort of holistic terms like that, like we have to. And this was the problem with the transition for Soviet Union, because it come from where everything was being done in these large enterprises, your education, your social security. And suddenly, my friend Jeffrey Sachs says you must have shock therapy. Well, it acts like a shock. And people just revolted, and then it was just turned down because you had not created the institutions to make the transition. I mean, you can't have institutions which were built up under the communist system or which were not built up during, and suddenly go to a system where we have the institutions because we have evolved under the capitalist system. So a lot of institutions have come up, so even there we have to make some changes. So I think the institutional part, which is you could call it political economy if you like, but it is a sort of political economy, that I think is important. So I think that is, the China thing is, we'll talk about it afterwards. There's many dimensions to it. I think it's slightly exaggerated in my view, but it's, the Congress is worried about it in a big way. The one time I testified in Congress many times, and usually there's just one or two people there. All the seats are empty, and then they're all pretending they're voting somewhere. I think they should be given iPods so they can listen and vote at the same time. But I don't know what they're voting for. Maybe I'll talk to a political scientist here in the audience. I think they're just making it up so as not to have to hear anything. And why have these testimonies, But anyways, there were only one or two people usually. One for the majority, who is the chair, and then the minority guy. When I testified on China, the whole semicircle was full, and people were just full of, enormous agitation. So it's a real issue. I mean, you have to address it. But what exactly to do is a very complicated issue because of imbalances, the exchange rate issue, what should they do inside in terms of increased spending and so on and so forth. It's not an easy thing. It's not like what Milton Friedman would say, just let the exchange rate adjust, because it's a question of what should be the optimal exchange rate. Because it's not just clearing the market, because the underlying fundamentals is what you're talking about, which affect, it's like the hands of the clock. I mean, it's the mechanism underneath that you're really talking about. Should the Chinese be doing something very different? Should we be doing something very different? So it's a very complicated issue, and I find it very difficult to really get my teeth really into it in a big way. And the macroeconomists are not much help, I'm afraid. Macroeconomics is one of the softest parts of the profession, in my opinion. So many of us just keep away from it. No, because it's a rapid-fire way to lose your reputation, such as it is, to get into that subject, Anything else?
You're very strong on trade liberalization. Do you think that agriculture is in any way a special industry as far as subsidies from developed world as subsidies for agricultural industries? Do you think that it should be as free and open as other industries?
Yeah, I think the two points, just very quickly. One is that our mindset on agriculture and the reason to subsidize is set by the notion that this is really Sam Shepard and who was the actress? Jessica Lange. You remember the movie The Country? That it's the small guys, the small families who are being ripped aside by the marketplace and so on, and they're struggling. The work by lots of people shows that in fact all the subsidies go to the large guys. I mean, people like Sam Donaldson own, everybody in the urban areas owns stock or whatever you call it in the big farms and so on, and Archer Midland, etc. So it's not, that mindset has been reinforced by movies, Willie Nelson songs, which are also for, and nobody, like Bonner, doesn't sing against the large farmers, for example. You know, he doesn't sing in favor of the small farmers in the poor countries, right? He's just creating money and selling, you know, I mean, I don't know what he's doing aside from singing. He's got his own show. But it's really, they're not countervailing in the same way these images, which therefore creates a problem for the congressman as well. Because if he really built it up in a big way, it probably might make a dent. You know, and the second thing, of course, is that the politics of the vote from the Midwestern states, I mean, they're so strong. I mean, even Grassley, who is otherwise quite sensible, but they will not budge on this. And the president spoke at some stage during the election about reducing trade subsidies, reducing agriculture stuff, but he's not been able to get anywhere on it. And that's going to be a big problem for Doha also. There's one thing we could do, which he hasn't tried, I think, enough, which is the European-style reform, because what we are interested, I mean, as American citizens, we would not want money to be wasted on subsidies to large, large, successful, large-scale people, farmers. But that's our internal problem. But as far as international trade is concerned, they're worried only about subsidies which are given for production or for trade, because that distorts the trade market, enables us to compete on, beyond what the markets would imply. So the foreigners are worried about what are called trade distorting subsidies, all right? And production distorting subsidies amount to trade distorting subsidies, because if we increase production, we increase trade, or reduce imports, or increase exports. So that is what we are interested in. What the Europeans did was to say, okay, we'll give the same amount of subsidy, but we'll give it in a non-distorting fashion, maybe for, in ways which would please PETA, right? So that we finance larger cages for chickens, better pens for the pigs, and so on and so forth. So we give it in ways which does not increase production, but which is green-related or cruelty-related, and so on and so forth. And that would be a way where we could then, satisfy foreigners who would then reciprocate. Because at the moment, we are stuck on that one. So one of the things some of us have been working on for quite a while is to try and say, look, let's maintain the agricultural support, because we live in the real world. And the president is not going to be able to really change overall support, at least not in his first term. And so why don't we just change the composition of it? I mean, it's easier to say that than to do it, but it's certainly better than not trying it. Okay? So these are the 2 points so Doha is going to depend on our being able to do something about the agricultural subsidies, which is another reason why I'm a little slightly pessimistic right now, whether the president will have he's got so many things on his plate, like healthcare and so on, and he's going to need as many votes as he can get. And therefore, he may just not want to take on the agricultural lobby in any way. Yeah.
From my understanding, some of the countries that are
Could you just bring it closer to your mouth? Yeah.
Yeah. From my understanding, some of the countries whose interests were not being recognized have stymied some of that progress of the trade agreements. And I just wonder what you propose should be done, what those countries should do to deal with the imbalance of representation, the U.S. having so much power within those agreements and the UN, what those countries should do.
Yeah, I didn't get into that because that's another set of issues which I do deal with. It's like, you're dealing with the Vatican rather than with Catholicism. So WTO, for instance, is where these issues are discussed and dealt with, and trade negotiations are under the chapeau, the umbrella of the thing. So and the rules are made there. So I think it's definitely, let me just start at WTO. WTO actually happens to be much more democratic than the Bretton Woods institutions, because the Bretton Woods institutions reflect donor countries, because they hand out monies, you see. The World Bank hands out monies for long run, and the IMF, which is almost out of business, it hands, until the current crisis, which put new blood into its, veins, that helps countries in distress, okay, with short-term liquidity. So these are two institutions which are giving out money, and the way the world works, the people who give money usually have more say in running an institution. WTO is just a negotiating chapeau, and therefore it is completely democratic. One country can hold up the entire negotiation. Like the USSR, Russia today, has been held up for 16 years by with EU also, but for many years by the United States. And one other country, which you can guess at, Georgia. So it was probably the Cheney-Rumsfeld vote. I don't know. But anyway, the point is, even if US agrees to let in, and if supposing Saakashvili says no, that's a problem there. Two, in terms of the election of people to head the thing, when Wolfensohn didn't work out, we just put in Zolik. I'm not saying anything about his merits or demerits. And the French put in, when Rato went away, the Spaniard, they put in a Frenchman, Dominique Strauss-Kahn. And there was no real question of anybody else from any other region, particularly the developing countries, making it at all. And the French, of course, said, like St. Augustine, we'll do it next time. Because you remember St. Augustine said, "Oh, dear God, grant me chastity, but not just yet." Right? And so that's what the French were saying. Yeah, maybe next time we'll do it. We'll get somebody from the developing country. So I think many of the young people who agitate against the WTO don't know that it is in fact far more democratic and has much more input from the developing countries and all kinds of development than actually the Bretton Woods institutions for the reasons that I mentioned. Are we going to get more representation in Bretton Woods? Yes, I think we will, because countries like India, China have now become bigger players. They've also become actual lenders. They're also part of the new expansion of funds, you see, which we have undertaken to make the IMF more viable given the needs in the rest of the world for borrowing in the current distress. So I think but it's because they've become potential donors and actual donors. So it's still using the same principle. If you say, is some poor country from Africa, is Botswana going to have a vote? I don't think so. I don't think so. Mexico gets a vote, but that's because I think Mexico is close to us, and we're still paying it off for having become part of NAFTA. There's also politics, of a different sort, friendship, proximity, etc. involved. Nothing is just one factor. So I feel that we will be moving in that direction the more multipolar the world gets. But in the end, in donor institutions, it is bound to be people who are giving the monies who are going to play a bigger role. You'll get more observation and so on. Like G8, you've got 5 countries, which are there, which are not actually voting members of G8. Actually, that's a great position to be in, because you get to eat at the banquets, you don't have to do any work. You get into the pictures also. So it's India, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, and there's one more, I've forgotten which one. So I think it's a steady process as the world gets more decentralized in terms of, accumulation of success, economic success and power. And I think that's the only way it's going to work. And the WTO there's nothing to change in my opinion at all, because it's always terribly democratic. Minor changes, but nothing to get excited about. Is that okay? Yeah.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so I'd like to thank you for coming tonight. If you'd like to hear about future events, please just fill out your card, drop it in the basket in the back, and then please join me in thanking Professor Bhagwati.